I'm sorry, I should have asked earlier. Okay. So last week we talked about the famous account of David and Goliath, and some of the things that we saw kind of in contrast between David and Saul. David was courageous while Saul was fearful. And really we get a good chance to see the heart of a king and the heart of a no longer king of Saul. And there's reasons why we get that chance to see that, because we know that God had already dismissed Saul from being king. And even though today what we're going to look at, we're going to see how Saul's still obviously desperately holding on to that that role of being king. He's tormented all the whole time through it. He's out of the will of God in the position he's in. He's just living it out, trying to hold on to it desperately, and he's just destroying. We're going to see here this morning, destroying his own relationships with his own son, and try to destroy others who did nothing wrong to him, just because of his heart that's away from God and not empowered by God to do what he's doing anymore. So we're going to look at today, really going to look at Jonathan and Saul. Jonathan and David. Jonathan is the son of Saul, and immediately, as we're going to find out here, becomes close-knit friends with David. It's the one who's supposed to be the next one to be king, who is the son of Saul, Jonathan. He immediately becomes friends with David, and on the very beginning immediately recognizes that he's not going to be the king, but David will be. And as we will see that in just a moment. But just really the heart of a person who recognizes his role. It is just amazing that while you got such a horrible dad, you got such a godly son that understands what God is doing, while the other one is refusing to submit to what God is doing. And that is sometimes happens in our world, doesn't it? Where we see a child follows the Lord while the parents don't. And their lives are drastically different in the way they view the Lord and the way they view what God's doing in the world. So, open up to 1 Samuel chapter number 17, and we're really just ending what we looked at last week, and then we're going to jump into chapter 18 and start working our way through the passage. We're really going to kind of pick up right off of what we did last week. So look at verse number 53. I'm going to read these because this is the last part we already read before. But down to 53, this is where we see, thank you, this is where we see David having taken Saul, killed Saul, and it tells us that as he's beginning to come back, that Saul's having the question, who is this boy that did this? Who is this boy? Now, again, let me throw this real quick before we go on. Look back at verse number 15 of chapter 17. Just a thought just to show you the timeline. You just couldn't help but notice it again. It says in verse number 15, but David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Well, what does it mean he returned from Saul? It means it goes back to what he was doing in chapter 16. He was playing music for Saul. So there was this kind of, it is interesting that this next statement that is made here, when Saul's asking, who is this boy? He obviously knew who this boy was. It has another meaning behind it, I think, as Fred said last week, that where did this boy come from to be like this? And I think that's the statement. So look at verse 53. It says, and the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents, and David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. And when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, and he said unto Abner, the captain of the host, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As thy soul liveth, O king, I cannot tell. And the king said, Inquire thou whose son the stripling is. And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son art thou, young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. And again, the only way to understand what that means and why he says it, I think, is because he's going deeper than just wanting names. That he wants to know his connection. Is he from a line of warriors? Because right immediately after this, just as we're going to see here, Saul makes him captain of the military. I mean, that's just to show you some things about him, that he is he's the general of the armies, basically, or one of the generals of the armies. And kind of gives you also some thoughts that David wasn't so small as everybody thinks he may have been, or such a little kid, if he's immediately made the general. So you don't put a little kid in charge of military, you know. So he's obviously got some size to him and skill to him already, as we saw back in chapter 16. All right, so from there, we're going to go ahead and read through verse 30 of chapter 18, basically the end of this chapter, and then we're going to read some out of 19. So let's do 18. We're going to split it up. 1 to 5, Bill. 6 to 10, David. 11 to 15, Wayne. 16 to 20, Darla. 21 to 25, Fred. And then 26 to 30, Esther. Okay.
Returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all cities in Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000. And Saul was very wroth.
Excuse me.
And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more than the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house, and David played with his hand as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand.
Mm-hmm. Not once, what? Meholathite. I think it's pronounced Michael there. I know that's a guy's name, but I think that's how it's supposed to be pronounced. Okay, 21. Okay, so we see a lot of things happening here. First off, right at the very beginning, as I said already, but what does the text tell us here about David and Jonathan, the bonding of David-Jonathan? What does it say there, right at the beginning of 18? Yeah, they were knit together, their souls. Jonathan loved David as his own soul. And what does Jonathan do with him right at the very beginning? Well, first off, verse 3 tells us something else before he does that. He makes a covenant with David. He makes a promise. Well, what's the covenant about? Well, then that's the answer of the next one. What does he do? He strips himself of his robe, his royal robe, gives it to David. Why would you give that to David? Takes his garments, even to his sword, the sword that's supposed to be recognized as royal, his girdle, which is his belt, gives all of that to David. This poor shepherd gets this given to him right off the bat with a covenant from the king's son. What was Jonathan recognizing about David from the very beginning? Yes. He immediately recognized that God wanted him to be the next king, not Jonathan. Boy, what a thought about that. What does that tell us about Jonathan, the character of Jonathan? Because Jonathan, in all human respects, was supposed to be the next king, even though God had already cut that line off through Saul's disobedience. And I'm sure Jonathan knew that. I'm guessing Jonathan knew that. I'm sure he wasn't ignorant of that information. He immediately recognizes, and it's not because David's going around saying, I've been already anointed to be king. I'm to be the next one. David hasn't said that, as far as we know, yet Jonathan recognizes it. And not only will Jonathan recognize it, or did Jonathan recognize it, who else will recognize it? Saul will begin to recognize that he's the one to become king. Just an amazing thought here. So these two are demonstrating this kind of, and by the way, Jonathan isn't doing this out of obligation. It says he loved him as his own soul. He had this kind of an affection for David that he realized that he didn't just know that he's supposed to be, but he wanted him to be the next king. You get that? Huh? Yeah, and David obviously demonstrated, it's just right after the whole event with David and Goliath, David demonstrated he is the man to be the king, right there by what he did with Goliath. And he demonstrated it before all the armies of Israel, that he is the man to be the next king. And a few people recognized it when it happened. So, let's see. After the battle with Goliath, what's Saul's actions toward David? Well, look at verse number 2 first. Yeah, you're right. Look at verse number 2. What's the first thing he does with him? Wouldn't let him go home anymore, as he had done before. You remember, that's what we saw back in chapter 17, verse 15, that he had returned from Saul to go help his father out. He's not allowed to go back home anymore. Why do you think he's got that attitude? He wants to keep a close watch on this guy. Yeah, uh-huh. Yeah, he's very paranoid at this point. And then something else starts to really promote this paranoia, and it's how the women responded to David and Saul. What did the women do when they were coming back from the battle, or when they were coming back from defeating the Philistines, and specifically Goliath being destroyed? Now, how many had David actually only killed? One. And yet, but basically, how does Saul look at this? Will he take the kingdom as well? If they're already saying this about David being greater than Saul, then they're going to be ready to give him the kingdom. So again, that adds more paranoia, irritation, anger, because it looks like even the nation is recognizing who the king should be, and it's not Saul. Right? Yeah. Yeah. Look at verses 12 and 28. We see some echoes. They're similar to each other. Verse 12 and 28. And it even can be referenced back to verse 14 of chapter 16. But look at 12 and 28 and see what makes them similar to each other. What's that? And not with him. He recognized it. He saw it, that the Lord was with David and not with him. And he already knew that the Lord was not with him, but he's sort of hoping that maybe Samuel's wrong, I think. He knows he's wrong. He knows he's out of the will of God, and I think he's defiantly trying to make himself still in the will of God when he's basically burned the bridge he can't get back to. Look at verse 17 and 21. At this point, verses 17 and verse 21, Saul attempts to make David his son-in-law. And why does he want to make him his son-in-law? And commander of the armies. To be a snare to him. Why would you make him commander of your armies? More likely to get killed in battle. He's intending to get rid of this little threat named David. And if he can't get rid of him through battle, he can at least use his daughter to manipulate him. That's his intent. That's his intent. Okay? So, eventually, he had one that was promised, but then it got given to another. That first daughter was given to another. And so then they came up with the second daughter of Saul, Michal. And so Michal, it says here, and it turns out, it's just like everything keeps working against Saul. Michal doesn't have any intention of being evil toward David. It said there in the text that she loved David. And that even itself angers Saul, because he wants her to kind of manipulate him. to use him, to try to get him to fall. And she's all about his well-being. In fact, she's one of the reasons why he ends up being saved from Saul, who plans to kill him at a later point, because of what she does. She actually hides David and protects David and gives him time to flee. We're not to that point. We won't look at that today, but just kind of giving you a bit of an idea that she's not playing into the plan of Saul either. Saul's trying every way he can to manipulate this thing, and he can't. And David, did he want to marry Michal? He saw it as a blessing to be given that right to be the daughter or the son-in-law to the king. But what was his restraint or his resistance to that? I'm poor, and I can't afford the king's dowry. You know that's how it works. So the king comes up with an alternate plan, which is really what he intended anyways, was you kill me 100 Philistines and give me their scalps in another way. I'm not going to get into the topic because of young ears, but you get what he's saying. And David, to show his love for the king, doesn't just get 100, he gets 200. To Saul, and he comes in and says, look, I did it, 200. I did just because I love you so much, king. It's like everything that David does and everything that's happening around Saul is just working contrary to Saul. Yeah, and everything keeps pointing to the greatness of David. He did. That just shows you Saul doesn't keep his own word. Just shows you Saul is not a man of his word. So we really get a clear contrast between the two, between Saul and David here, don't we? We see how Saul is collapsing right before his own people. His own family doesn't even recognize him, and they're not on board with his attitude and his actions. And David just is rising. He's like cream, on the top of milk. He's just rising to the top. All right, let's go on. So, and here's another little thought to throw in here, because it's not in my questions, but it is another little thought. Did you see there that David still continued to do another ministry that he had previously done? And that was play music for Saul in the times of his distressing moments when the evil spirit from the Lord was basically harassing him. He played music, and in the middle of that, while he's being calmed, he takes a javelin, and he does it just one time, he does it twice. And it's not just twice he does it to David. We're going to see a third time he does it. And David keeps returning. Don't understand David, but he does. And he keeps loving him. I mean, there's a reason why he's called a man after God's own heart. He loves his own enemies. He loves someone who wants him dead. And I think David is wise enough to realize that's what he wants. I don't think David is just oblivious to what's happening around him. I don't think he's oblivious to the fact that Saul's trying to connive and manipulate him to try to get him killed. I do think it's interesting that Saul did the same thing that David would later do to try to cover his sin. Anybody remember that? David and Bathsheba. And David gets Bathsheba pregnant, and to try to cover the sin, he tried to have Uriah come back and spend the night with his wife, but Uriah was more honorable than David at that point, because he said, there's men out fighting and I'm in here hanging out with my wife. No, I can't do that right now. And so he sends a letter by Uriah back out to the battle and tells the captain, go sit him in the hottest part of the battle, and then when it gets very fierce, you will have everybody else back off and let him fight by himself, and then he'll die. That's exactly what Saul's trying to do to David. Maybe he learned it from Saul. Yeah. Well, we haven't got to that point, but the Lord did stay with him. You might remember that one of the things that David did say in that Psalm 51, in his Psalm of penitence, was that, Lord, don't take your spirit from me. He knew that the Lord had done that with Saul. Yeah. Had haunted him with a bitter spirit. Okay. Now, so here's a question to ask ourselves. Now, going back to Jonathan for a moment. Jonathan seeks to bless David, shows his love to David, even willing to sacrifice what would humanly be his spot when Saul dies. He's going to be the next king. We know that God's already said that's not going to happen, but humanly speaking, Jonathan has the right to be the next king. But Jonathan is willing to yield that over to David. Ask you the question, if you were in Jonathan's shoes, would you have that attitude? Probably not. I'm sure he, wherever he got his information, I'm sure he knew Dad was in trouble with the Lord. He's Dad's next in line. Yeah. Yeah. It just shows you that Jonathan had a right spirit as well. He had a heart like David did. I honestly believe he did. At least to some level he did. So, all right, so let's go over to chapter 19 and read verses 1 to 10, and then we're going to pick up and then in chapter 20. So look at 1 to 10. I'm going to let two readers, Bill and David. 1 to 5, 6 to 10. Okay.
And Saul hearkened unto the voice of Jonathan, and Saul sware, as the Lord liveth, each one Jonathan called David, and Jonathan showed him all those things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, in his presence, as in times past. And there was war again, and David went out and fought with the Philistines, and slew them with a great slaughter, and they fled from him. And the evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul, as he sat in his house with his javelin in his hand. And David played with his hand. And Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with the javelin. But he slipped away out of Saul's presence, and he smote the javelin into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night.
Wow. All right. So, yeah. So let's go on. So why didn't Jonathan obey his father's command to kill David? Yeah, he loved him. He delighted in him, it says there. Much in David. He'd already made a covenant with David. And it's a covenant not just between him and David, but it's obviously a covenant with the Lord in mind, that he's made a promise to God that he's recognized that David would be that position as king. And he thought his father's command was unjust, didn't he? That David hasn't done anything worthy of death. He's only sought your good. He's only sought to be good in your sight. He's brought security to Israel for you, basically. So, despite his vow, Saul chose to make another attempt on David's life. He promises that he's not going to do it, and then he makes another attempt. What was the attempt? Throw the javelin at him again. I think, if I'd been David, I'd say, I'm not going to play that music if you got that javelin in your hand. He did. I think there is a sense in which David knows God's plan for him and is confident in God's plan for him. It is really an amazing thing about David when you really start to look at it, that David knows what God has already set him apart to do, and yet David is demonstrating the greatest humility you could be. He's supposed to be sitting on that throne. He knows he's supposed to be sitting on that throne. He knows Saul wants him dead, and yet he keeps honoring Saul no matter what. Yeah. And you remember, there's 2 times he had opportunity to kill Saul later. We're not to that point, but he had 2 times he had opportunity to kill Saul. And he's the one where we get that famous line, I will not do anything against the Lord's anointed. I'll not put my hand against any. But Saul is not the king anymore, by divine decree. God has already broke him down, has already said he's no longer allowed. Well, while he's in that position of power, I won't do anything to stop it. And even after he dies, do you remember what happens I think it's in 1 Kings is where it's at. After he dies, somebody comes and falsely reports that he killed Saul to try to get a reward from David. And David said, you had no fear against God that you would strike down the Lord's anointed? And he says, since you did that, I'll take your life, and killed the guy. And now this is the guy that has been hunting him down for almost 10, 15 years. And yet he still chose to love him and honor him, an enemy. That should convict all of us, shouldn't it? About the way we treat our enemies. That we should have the attitude that we want to bless them with all our heart and honor them despite the fact that they seek our harm. Okay. God knows how to protect those that are His own. All right, look at chapter 20. We're going to work our way through chapter 20 quite a bit here. And I don't have a bunch of questions to ask you in 20, but we want to see a few more things here. We're going to do 1 through 17 first. So if I can get 1 through 5. Bill, 6 through 10. Wayne. And then 11 through, you want to do to the end of 17? I'll give you a little extra. All right. See, there's that covenant. We'll stop right there. What did Jonathan acknowledge about David in verses 13 and 15? What does he acknowledge? Yeah, that the Lord is going to be the one who puts him in this position, and that he won't die, and that God will strike down the enemies of David. And then they make this covenant again, this covenant between their families, that whenever the enemies of David are gone, that David's family will honor Jonathan's family, even though he comes out of the line of Saul. He's recognizing that Saul is the enemy. Jonathan is. And that David's family will honor the family of Jonathan. You might remember that's where that famous Mephibosheth story comes into play, because that was a son of Jonathan. Mephibosheth, the one that had fallen, been crippled from his youth, and he takes him and has him live at his house and feeds him and takes care of him, even though he's not able to take care of himself, all the days of his kingdom. David does, the son of Saul. So this is that attitude that's going on. They are once again making promise that no matter what happens, we will still honor each other in the middle of this, even though God will deal with this threat eventually. All right, jump down to verse 30 through 42. Really, we could just keep reading. In fact, let me just kind of tell you what happens here. What the plan is basically when we go back in, and we're going to sit at the table, and you're not there in your place, and Saul's going to wonder why you're not there. Jonathan, here's what you're to say: that I'm going to my father's house to sacrifice there and to be with my family and see them, and I got permission from you to do so, from Jonathan to do so. And if he's okay with it, then I'll know that he's not intending to kill me. But if he's angry in that answer, then I know he's intending to kill me. And they had this little sign in which they're going to communicate this message, because I want you to think about it. The reason why they have to communicate the way they're going to communicate is because they don't know who they can trust. Who's infected with the hatred of Saul and who's not. And so the sign was basically, you were going to go out to a certain place, and I'm going to shoot arrows like I'm practicing, and I'm going to have my servant go run and get the arrows, and if I say it's beyond where you are at, then you're going to know that it's time for you to leave, that you can't hang around here anymore. And thus will start the the fugitive chase of David and Saul, where Saul chases David like he's a fugitive. And so that's really the issue that's going on, and now we get to see that play out. So look at verse 30 through 42. So who wants to read 30 through 35, or 30 through 34? Well, let's just do 30 through 35. Okay, 30 through 35, 36 through 40. Okay, well, I'll just do 42, up to 42. All right, go ahead, Fred.
Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan. He said unto him, Thou son of a perverse and rebellious woman, do not I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse to thine own confusion, and to the confusion of thy mother's nakedness?
Now, hold on. Did you see there he said, thy son of a perverse, rebellious woman? He's referring to his wife. It's sort of like when you hear people say something that's very derogatory said, what he just called his son. If you know what I'm talking about, you don't have to say it, but you know what I'm saying. Okay, 31. Go ahead.
For as long as the son of Jesse liveth upon the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. Wherefore now sin, and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die. And Jonathan answered Saul his father, and said unto him, Wherefore shall he be slain? And what hath he done? Saul cast a javelin at him to slay him. Whereby Jonathan knew that it was determined of his father to slay David.
That's how he knew. That's how he knew Saul wanted to kill David. He threw his javelin at him. Yeah.
Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger, and did eat no meat the second day of the month. And he was grieved for David, because his father had died. Jonathan went out to the field at the time of morning with David and a little lad.
And he said unto his lad, Run, find out now the arrows which I shoot. And as the lad ran, he shot an arrow beyond them. And the lad was come to the place of the arrow which Jonathan had shot. Jonathan cried after the lad and said, Shoot not the arrow beyond thee, not the arrow beyond thee. And Jonathan cried after the lad, Make speed, hasten, stay not. And Jonathan's lad gathered up the arrows and came to his master. But the lad knew not anything, only Jonathan and David knew the matter. And Jonathan gave his artillery to his lad and said to him, Go carry them to the city. And as soon as the lad was gone, David arose out of a place toward the south, fell on his face to the ground, and bowed himself 3 times, and kissed one another, and wept with one another, until David exceeded. And Jonathan said to David, Go in peace, for as much as we have sworn both of us in the manner of the Lord, saying, The Lord be between me and thee, and between thy seed and thy seed forever. And he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city.
Okay, so at this point, on that second night, how does Saul respond to the question, or respond to the fact that David's not there eating at the table? He gets angry, and he basically says, Jonathan, you're a shameful son, and you're stupid. Because don't you realize the more affection you have for that David, and how often you're protecting him, and how often you're trying to stand for him, means that you're going to lose your own kingdom. And Jonathan already knows that. He's not intending to have the kingdom. We just really see the two differences between Saul and Jonathan here. Saul knows he's not supposed to have the kingdom go on, but Saul's bullheaded enough, he's going to keep trying to push against God. And so, how does Saul demonstrate his final bit of wrath against David and Jonathan? Throws a javelin at him. Wow, can you imagine the feelings of betrayal right there? And rejection? That you do that to your own kid? That's hard. And I imagine, even though Jonathan stays with his dad, and all the way to his end, fights with him to the death, you'll see it as Saul's life comes to an end. He ends up dying with his dad. But there surely weren't these lovey-dovey feelings between father and son. No. Okay? And so the signal was, if you shoot the arrow beyond, if you say the arrow is further than where you're looking, that was the sign. And as soon as he gives that sign, he tells the lad to go on and take my stuff and go back inside. And then he tells David, and they remind themselves of the covenant they both have made for each other, first off, that Jonathan understood that David would be king. Secondly, that David, when he does become king and God puts down all the enemies of David, that David would remember Saul's family and Jonathan's family specifically. That they'd remember each other by a mutual love for those two families with each other. Okay? So, at this point they end up leaving. And the leaving there that we see is accompanied with all sorts of affection for each other. Crying, hugging, even kissing on each other. Is it all right for men to kiss each other in a manly way? Huh? Okay. Actually, that's going to bring me to a final activity point, because I want to deal with something that gets brought up by people who are looking to justify their sinful behavior. Do you believe there are people who use the Bible to try to make the Bible mean what it doesn't mean? Who want to pervert the Bible? Well, this event I just spent the last almost hour talking to you about, 45 minutes talking to you about, is an event that people who are part of the homosexual agenda tried to say that David and Jonathan were that with each other because they loved each other. So I want to argue that for a minute. I don't want to take a long time arguing that. So if you'll pass these out real quick, and we're going to get right through it real quick. But I do want to argue the case real quick for you. And we're going to talk about it. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Let me jump into this real quick. Will someone read that while we're passing them out? Read the introduction there. Who wants to read it? Go ahead, Bill. Okay, so can I get someone who will read those three passages? You're going to, one at a time. So we've already read two of them already, but the third one is one we have yet to read. So who wants to read 1 Samuel 18:3? Okay, Wayne? And the 20:17. We'll do that one? Okay, and then 2 Samuel 1:25 through 26. Darla, you want to do that one? Okay, 2 Samuel. Okay, go ahead, Wayne. Read it for us. Okay, loved him as his own soul. Loved his own soul. Okay, and Darla's got the last one. This is after Jonathan's gone. First Samuel 1. Okay, and that's the one they really hang on, but we're going to look at that for a minute. So, what characterized the relationship between David and Jonathan? What would he say? They loved each other like brothers. And as his own soul, he mentions there. And then even beyond that of the love between a man and a woman. Let me ask you something. just to kind of challenge that viewpoint for a second. Should you love Jesus Christ more than you love your mate?
Yes.
Is it a sexual relationship then? No. So just because David said that doesn't make it a sexual relationship, right? Okay, yeah. We understand it's not. I know you all probably know that. Just challenging that viewpoint because people will say that. Okay, number 2 or B there. How do these verses relate to Leviticus 19:18 and Matthew 22:39? These are good to read and remember. Leviticus 19:18. Who wants to read that? Go ahead. And then the 22:39. Someone want to read that one? Real quick, Matthew 22:39. Real quick, we got to move quick if we're going to get done. Okay, go ahead. Yep, you're right. Oh, love thy neighbor as thyself. Oh, okay. Go ahead. Oh, you didn't have it. It was Fred. Sorry. Okay. So would loving somebody as your own soul be the same category of that? Is that the same thing? Loving your neighbor as yourself, is it loving him as you love your own soul? Yeah, it's exactly the same thing, isn't it? And it's not commanded that just David and Jonathan would do that, but that everybody should do that with everybody. Right? Okay? So they were actually following a model of what it means to love, how you're supposed to love one another. But obviously theirs was a friendship love, that they had a love for each other that went to a friendship, that they made a covenant to each other, promises to each other before the Lord, that they would do certain things in regards to this. All right, 1 Corinthians 6:9 through 11. Who wants to read that one real quick? You got it? Go ahead, real loud for us. Okay, so there he gives a list of all sorts of sins in there. You got fornication mentioned, adultery mentioned. Then he mentions there the word effeminate, which is the word malakoi, and then abusers of themselves with mankind. It's another word, arsenokoite, and those words are just descriptives of homosexual behavior. Okay? I'm not going to get into the actual understanding what those mean. They are kind of grotesque a little bit, but he's obviously listing it with a group of other kinds of sins. And what does he say about them? That they can't what? Inherit the kingdom of heaven. They can't inherit the kingdom of heaven. So that would put David, if he is doing these kinds of things, outside of the kingdom of heaven. Yet God has promised that the Son of God would receive the throne of his father David, which is related to the kingdom of heaven. You understand that? It's connected to it. So I don't really think that is true. What do you think? Okay. Which of the sins listed in this passage are you guilty of? I'm not asking for a confession right now. You can write that personally. Okay? I'm sure we could probably all say at least we've been greedy at times, or we've reviled people's names at times, which is one of the sins there. All right, number C, or letter C. Does homosexuality have a different judgment than these other sins listed in this passage? What's the answer? No, not in the sense of the fact that they are all being blocked out. By the way, we can throw any sin is going to block somebody out of the kingdom of heaven, right? Because it's sin that separates us from God. Okay? But what hope does this passage offer? Forgiveness. Such were some of you, but you are washed, cleansed, sanctified. Yeah, the Lord Jesus Christ cleanses us from sin. Yeah. Okay. Number 3. Based on what you read, is there any justification for the claims that David and Jonathan were involved in that kind of a relationship? No. Nothing in the text would indicate that any bit of an illicit relationship going on between those two. And besides that, if we want to go on a little bit further here, look at this one. I'm not going to. I'm going to let you see it as we get to it. Number 4, how could you respond to someone who made the claims that Jonathan's giving his clothes to David, the statements of mutual love, the covenant between the two, and the kiss mentioned in 2041 amount to a clear case that the two men were involved in a homosexual relationship? How could you argue against that? What's the context about? What's more than just brotherly love? There's something else mentioned. He's given up his throne. He's recognizing my throne will no longer be my throne, it's David's. David gets to be the king, not me. Okay? It has nothing to do with that. Okay? Number 5. While Scripture is clear that homosexual behavior is a sin, there are both Old and New Testament passages on the matter. We Christians often elevate it to a special status above all sins. How can we respond in a way that will be helpful to the individual if someone admits they have committed this sin? Give me some ideas. Okay. Okay. There's still punishment. Okay. Now, does it have different consequences? It does. In life, it does. Right? We understand that. And even in biblical life, it does. But what were you going to say? We can all be forgiven by Jesus Christ. That's what that passage in 1 Corinthians 6 said. But ye were these things, but you're now cleansed, washed, sanctified in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Right? Can you be forgiven? Yes. Jesus said there was only one sin that can't be forgiven. Does anyone remember what that was? Blasphemy of the Holy Ghost. What is blasphemy of the Holy Ghost? Not grieving. What does blaspheming the Holy Ghost mean? It's contributing the works of Christ. And it's kind of hard to figure out how you can do that if you're not living in the time of Christ and seeing His miracles done right in your presence. But there is maybe another way that can happen, and that is continued rejection to the gospel. And that'd be more like hardening your heart, where you harden your heart to the point that God says, I'm not giving you any more invitations. Yep. To each other that way, yeah. There's a common fellowship that shows up immediately because of their relationship with God. Yep. Yeah, it's like what we have as brothers and sisters here. There's a common love that we all have for each other. It's a family type love because we have the same relationship with Christ. Yep. Okay. Number 6, last one. Was that where we're at? Number 6? Okay. How can we keep our own prejudices from causing us to unrighteously judge those who sin in ways that we find worse than our own sins? That's right. Good job. What does Paul say? I am what I am by the grace of God. Did you know if the grace of God had not captured Paul's life, he would have gone on, continued to be a murderer, a blasphemer, a rejecter of Christ, right? It was the grace of God that caught his soul from that. And that's exactly what happens. If you're a righteous person in your life, it's not because you were naturally that way. It's because someone caught you. Right? You understand that? Because they've been saved and so different. Wasn't that what we're saved for? Is to be made like Christ. You're saved to become like Christ. You're not saved to continue being the old person you were. You're saved to be made a new person. Yeah, old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. All right. Well, I've got questions, but we're out of time, so we're going to go ahead and close in prayer for all of you. I hope that's kind of a help to you. So if you ever hear that, and you probably may not hear it very often, but if you happen to pay attention to things that are going on in our culture, you'll hear people using that. Even when I was trying to put a thumbnail on our thumbnail, it's a picture that goes on the YouTube video. And I was looking up pictures for David and Jonathan. There was all sorts of trash against trying to call that David and Jonathan were lovers like that, and just horrible. But that you may not hear it very often unless you're actually around that enough, around that culture enough. But just so you're armed with the truth, and you know the truth, and you know what the Scripture's saying. You know the background to why they did what they did. It had everything to do with a covenant relationship between David and Jonathan in regards to who would be the king and how God would deal with the enemies of David. And it was a friendship. It was a friendship. And, you know, it's a challenge maybe to us, as all of us, as we realize we need friends like that. We need friends like that. We need to have people that we can trust our heart and life to, and bear our soul to, and trust our families to. Yeah, because that's exactly what they did, didn't they? So that's important to remember. Huh? His children. Yeah, that's exactly what they were covenanting about. Yeah. Okay. Why don't you close this in prayer, Fred, and then we are done for this morning Sunday school.